just for stealing a piece of bread for his starving nephew. A man named Jean Valjean had to endure hard labor for 19 years. Initially, Jean was only sentenced to 5 years in prison for theft, but because of several unsuccessful escape attempts, his sentence was extended by another 14 years. After a long period that seemed endless, the day finally came for Jean to be released. However, the cruel Inspector Javert always sought to make things difficult. He ordered Jean to lift a giant flagpole out of the mud. For anyone else, this task would have seemed impossible, but because of his superhuman strength, Jean easily completed the task to everyone's amazement. At this moment, Javert announced that Jean's sentence was over, and at the same time, he gave Jean a travel permit and demanded he always carry it with him, which stated that Jean was a dangerous individual. This meant that he was still under surveillance and had to report his whereabouts monthly, or else he would be imprisoned. Jean was extremely indignant at these absurd decisions. For just a piece of bread, he had paid the price with 19 years of hard labor. Was that still not enough? However, Javert paid no attention to what Jean said. To him, if you commit a crime just once, you will carry a bad reputation for life. Although he did not resign himself to it, Jean was still forced to accept his fate. Now he was officially out of prison, but the road ahead was still full of thorns. No place would hire Jean because no one wanted to employ a dangerous individual. Even the innkeeper refused to rent him a room. Even when Jean just wanted to sleep in a wretched stable, he was driven away. In his moment of despair, Jean happened to meet a kind-hearted bishop named Muriel. Not only did the bishop invite Jean for dinner, but he also arranged a place for him to rest. Despite being treated with great kindness, that night, Jean did something no one could have expected. While Bishop Muriel and the others were sound asleep, Jean took the silverware and fled into the night. Unexpectedly, the next morning, he was caught by the police and escorted to the church. However, instead of accusing Jean, the bishop helped him escape punishment. Muriel told the police that he himself had gifted those items to Jean. Not only that, the bishop also gave him 2 precious candlesticks, saying that Jean had forgotten to take them in his haste to leave. The police were completely convinced, and thanks to that, Jean was released. After the police left, the bishop told Jean he could sell those items and hoped he would become an honest man. Moved by the bishop's kindness, Jean vowed that from now on he would change himself and let go of his sinful past. Without a moment's hesitation, he tore up the travel permit and officially became a different person. In the blink of an eye, 8 years had passed, and Jean had now become a man of status in society. To hide his identity, he had changed his name to Madeleine. Not only did he hold the position of mayor, but Jean was also the owner of a garment factory. In the factory, there was a very beautiful girl named Fantine. But because of that beauty, she was often harassed by the foreman. Not wanting to lose her job, Fantine could only endure it patiently. Meanwhile, the other female workers were jealous of Fantine's beauty and always tried to harm her. After learning that Fantine had an illegitimate daughter, the others constantly insulted her and threatened to report her to the foreman to get her fired. Just then, the argument was accidentally witnessed by Jean. Jean was about to intervene when an inspector arrived to see him. Jean was startled to realize it was none other than Javert. Unable to keep his guest waiting, Jean handed the matter over to the foreman to handle. After Jean left, the female workers told the foreman everything. Realizing Fantine was no longer chaste, the foreman showed great contempt and disdain for her. He fired Fantine outright without a second thought, despite her pleas. On the other side, Jean was afraid his identity would be exposed. But it seemed Javert did not recognize him at all. He just wanted to get acquainted with the mayor as he had just been transferred to work here. At that moment, a cry for help was suddenly heard from outside. Jean and Javert ran down and saw an overturned carriage. Without hesitation, Jean used all his strength to lift the log off the trapped man. But this very act inadvertently reminded Javert of the prisoner with extraordinary strength who could carry the flagpole alone. Immediately, Javert became suspicious of the mayor's identity, but with no evidence, he could do nothing. As for Fantine, after losing her job, her life became extremely miserable. To have money to care for her daughter, Fantine had to sell her hair and even sell her teeth to pay off debts. Finally, with no other choice, Fantine was forced to become a prostitute. One time, feeling unwell, Fantine refused a client. While resisting, she attacked the man, injuring him. Just then, Inspector Javert was patrolling nearby. The man immediately accused and charged Fantine with deliberately attacking him. Looking at the wound on the man's face, Javert thought the case was clear, and therefore Fantine must face punishment before the law. Just then, Jean appeared and recognized Fantine as a former worker from his factory. Jean approached to inquire and learned that she had been fired that day only because he had delegated the task to the foreman. Fantine was in this state now because she needed money for her daughter's treatment. Feeling guilty, Jean promised Fantine he would help her daughter. He then decided to take Fantine to the hospital, despite the judgmental stares of those around him. A few days later, Javert received a letter from headquarters, informing him that they had captured the fugitive named Jean Valjean. This greatly surprised Javert, as he had always believed the mayor was the real fugitive. That evening, Javert went to Jean to apologize. He felt extremely guilty for having misunderstood such a righteous man. Jean advised the inspector not to blame himself and said that he had performed his duties very well. After the inspector left, Jean's conscience was torn. If he remained silent, he would be free. However, he would have to live in torment for the rest of his life. But if he confessed everything, it would also mean the end of his life and career. After thinking for a long time, Jean still could not make a choice. Finally, he decided to rush into the courthouse and declare that he was the real fugitive. In the end, conscience triumphed over selfishness. Jean could not stand by and watch that innocent man die for him. Everyone was utterly astonished and could not believe that the noble mayor was a criminal. A little later, Jean went to the hospital to see Fantine. Due to living in terrible conditions for a long time, she had contracted tuberculosis. Although she was near death, Fantine could not stop thinking about her poor daughter. Sympathizing with her miserable fate, Jean promised that he would take care of Fantine's daughter and help her have a better life. Those promises somewhat soothed Fantine's suffering soul. Now, she no longer had to worry and passed away peacefully in Jean's arms. At this time, Inspector Javert had also arrived. Jean begged him for 3 days to arrange everything. However, Javert refused, thinking he was just making an excuse to escape. Unable to persuade the inspector, Jean jumped into the river to escape. At this time, Cosette was living with the innkeepers, the Thénardiers. These two took money from Fantine to care for the little girl, but treated Cosette like a servant. Meanwhile, their own daughter was treated like a princess. That night, Jean went to the Thénardiers to buy back Cosette. Jean also told them that Fantine had passed away, and from now on he would adopt Cosette as his daughter. Hearing this, the Thénardiers began to act. They said they treated Cosette like their own daughter and would be very sad if the little girl left. Their purpose was to increase the redemption price. Jean had long known that these two were no good, so he did not want to argue with them. He paid a large sum of money and quickly left with Cosette. The little girl's appearance seemed to bring a ray of hope into Jean's life. However, the road ahead for both of them was still very dark. At this time, Javert arrived at the inn, and the Thénardiers told him that Jean had left with Cosette. The inspector was furious and immediately sent men after them. A little later, Javert and his soldiers caught up with Jean's carriage. Sensing danger, Jean led Cosette to flee. However, Javert and his soldiers continued to pursue, and the two were cornered. Thanks to a rope, the two were lucky enough to climb over the wall and reach a convent. Here, Jean met the man he had saved before. To repay the kindness, the man arranged for Jean and his daughter a place to stay right at the convent. From then on, the two lived in anonymity, escaping the pursuit of the inspector. Javert was furious for letting the criminal escape once again. In the name of justice, he swore that at all costs he must capture Jean to bring him to justice. In the blink of an eye, 9 years had passed. On a street in the capital of Paris, an organization for the poor workers was spreading their ideas. This organization was led by progressive-minded students. Among them was a young man named Marius. Although born into a wealthy aristocratic family, Marius had ignored his family's objections and devoted himself to the organization. Meanwhile, the little girl Cosette from years ago had now become a young woman with a beauty that moved hearts. From their very first meeting, Cosette and Marius fell in love, although they did not yet know each other's names. Among those who secretly loved Marius was a girl named Eponine. She was none other than the daughter of the innkeepers. Due to years of unprincipled and dishonest practices, their family had now become homeless. Fate arranged for the Thénardiers to accidentally meet father and daughter Cosette again in the midst of the bustling crowd. The wife recognized Jean and screamed incessantly, demanding he pay more redemption money. Just then, Inspector Javert appeared again and was approaching them. Recognizing the inspector, Jean, fearing discovery, immediately led his daughter away. At this moment, Eponine also recognized Cosette and was surprised by the changes. Noticing that the two seemed to know each other, Marius asked Eponine to help him find Cosette's address. Unable to refuse the one she secretly loved, Eponine agreed to help. That evening, Marius and the other students received news that General Lamarck had passed away. He was the only general who sided with the poor working people, so he was much loved. After some discussion, the student group decided to turn the people's grief into revolutionary strength. They would use General Lamarck's funeral the next morning to launch an uprising. A little later, Eponine came to Marius to take him to Cosette's house. Since returning home, Cosette could not stop thinking about the image of the student she had fallen for. Cosette also wondered why she and her father had always had to hide. However, when Cosette wanted to know the reason, her father always avoided it and did not want to talk about it. She had grown up and wanted a stable home, but everything seemed too far away. Feeling a little sad, Cosette went out for a walk. Just then, Marius had also found his way there. The two introduced themselves and constantly exchanged sweet words. Witnessing the man she loved laughing happily with another girl made Eponine very sad, but there was nothing she could do. The conversation was suddenly interrupted when Jean unexpectedly approached. He ordered Cosette to go back inside. After Marius left, Thénardier and his cronies arrived. They intended to sneak into Jean's house to steal, but Eponine stopped her father from doing so. She screamed, causing the whole gang of scoundrels to flee in fear. Thinking that Javert had found them, Jean immediately packed their things and told Cosette that they would be leaving for England. Before leaving, Cosette left a letter for Marius. However, Eponine was the one who got that letter. After learning that the one he loved had moved away without a word, Marius was extremely hurt and desperate. But in the end, he still chose to stand shoulder to shoulder with his comrades. The next morning, as the funeral procession passed through the square, Marius and his comrades climbed onto the general's hearse and raised the banner of resistance. The surrounding people also flocked to join them. At this time, the army was also advancing to quell the riot. A soldier accidentally shot and killed an elderly woman, and a riot immediately broke out. The people were extremely angry and simultaneously threw things onto the street to block the army's advance. However, due to the great disparity in forces, the rebel group was suppressed and pushed back into the narrow alleys. That night, Javert disguised himself and infiltrated the ranks of the rebel group. He intended to use false information to mislead them. However, a boy named Gavroche soon discovered the inspector's identity, and he was immediately captured. At this time, the army had also arrived and attacked fiercely. The rebels quickly fell into a dangerous situation. Knowing they could not fight back, Marius took out a barrel of gunpowder and threatened to detonate it. Seeing this, the army became frightened and retreated. While protecting Marius, Eponine was unfortunately shot in the chaos and seriously injured. As she was dying, she gave Cosette's letter to Marius. Finally, Eponine passed away in the arms of the man she loved. Thanks to the letter, Marius learned Cosette's current address. He immediately wrote a letter and had someone deliver it there. After reading the letter, Jean realized that his daughter and the student had fallen in love. Fearing Cosette would suffer if Marius died, Jean took immediate action. He disguised himself as a soldier to get through the siege and then went to meet the revolutionary soldiers. Just then, some enemies were hiding up high, planning a sneak attack. Fortunately, Jean spotted them in time and shot them down. Noticing Javert was tied up in a corner, Jean said to let him handle the inspector, and the others agreed. After leading Javert to a deserted place, Jean cut the ropes and let him go. Javert was completely surprised because he thought Jean would take revenge. However, things were not as he thought. Jean had never blamed the inspector because, to him, Javert was just doing his job. The next morning, the army continued to surround and attack. The commander gave the rebels a chance to surrender, but they still decided to take up arms and fight. The army commander immediately ordered the cannons to fire, and the soldiers began to advance. Despite trying to resist, the barricade was finally destroyed, forcing the student group to flee. The army charged forward, and the revolutionary soldiers fell one by one. Finally, the student group was cornered. Even so, before they died, they still held high the flag of resistance. In the chaos, Jean found Marius seriously injured and unconscious. He saved the young man, and they both escaped into a sewer. On the other side, Javert found the body of the boy Gavroche, who had died heroically. He could not hold back his emotions, so he took off his medal and placed it on the boy's body. Suddenly, Javert heard a sound coming from the nearby sewer. At this moment, Jean was looking for an exit when he accidentally ran into the innkeeper, who was also there. Thénardier took Marius's gold ring in exchange for showing them the way out. A little later, Jean and Marius got out, but Javert was waiting there. Jean asked for an hour to take Marius to the hospital, but the inspector refused. Javert threatened that if Jean dared to take another step, he would shoot. But in the end, he could not bring himself to do it and just stood there watching Jean and Marius leave. At this moment, Javert seemed to have lost faith in his own ideals. He had betrayed the law and betrayed justice. It turned out that the absolute justice he had always been proud of suddenly became meaningless before a criminal who possessed altruism. Facing this upside-down world, Javert could not bear it anymore. Finally, the inspector threw himself into the Seine River, ending his own life. The next morning, Marius woke up and could walk on his own. The young man was extremely pained to realize that all his comrades had fallen and he was the only survivor. Marius was reunited with his love, and Cosette was like a ray of light helping the young man overcome the dark night. Although Javert was dead, Jean's sentence remained. He realized that Cosette had found happiness and decided to leave so as not to affect his daughter. Jean told Marius everything and asked him to keep it a secret. Sometime later, the young couple held their wedding. The Thénardiers disguised themselves as guests and snuck into the party to steal. Marius discovered them and asked them to leave. Suddenly, Marius saw the gold ring on Thénardier's hand and wanted to know where he got it. Thénardier said he took it when he accidentally found Jean and Marius hiding in the sewer. It was only then that Marius realized Cosette's father was the one who had saved his life. Thénardier also said he had seen Jean living at a convent. Immediately, Marius and Cosette set off for there. When they arrived, Jean was already near death. He gave his daughter a letter, in which he recounted his entire life. Cosette and Marius were deeply moved by the love and sacrifice their father had shown for them. Now, all of Jean's wishes were fulfilled, and he passed away peacefully in the arms of his two children. Finally, Jean was reunited with the kind-hearted bishop and the female factory worker. One had saved his soul, and one had given him hope to live. Today's story ends here. Thank you for watching. What do you think of this movie? Please comment below.